Hello everyone. Welcome, welcome. We have people still filtering in through the waiting room, so I'm just admitting everyone. We are recording as well, and again, as with all the sessions today, the recording will be uploaded onto the video library. Oh, more people in the waiting room. Okay, this is your second breakout session of the day. You have survived thus far. Congratulations and well done. I hope you had a good time in your writing workshop that you've just come out of and had a bit of a break. This is now the Pitch Perfect session. So I'm delighted that we're joined by Hattie Grünewald here, who will be shortly taking you through top tips on how to pitch to agents if you're working on fiction for adults. Hopefully that's sounding familiar to you and no one's thinking, God, I'm in the wrong breakout group. If you are, just head straight back to the portal and you'll be able to find the right link. Just a quick note that this is a very large group. So you might have been in a previous session where you've been able to chat a bit, but we're going to try and ask you just to stick to the chat. We're keeping all the videos on just so that it's a bit more, it feels a bit more friendly. But please do keep your audio off until such time as there might be an opportunity to ask some questions, but please pop stuff in the chat if you like. The live transcript is running. You can disable it or move it around your screen by using the live transcript button at the bottom of your screens. And as I say, please do use the chat. We've got 4 more people in the waiting room. Hang on, let me let them in. There they are. And I will hand over, I'm going to spotlight your tutor now if it's working. Let me see if the button works. Here we go. Here is Hattie Grünewald, who we're really pleased can join us. She's an incredible agent. Please do look her up. And I will hand straight over to Hattie for her pitch session on writing adult fiction.
Hi, everyone. Really nice. Thank you for coming today to come talk to me. Thank you. It's really nice to have so many people here. A bit daunting, but really looking forward to talking to you all and meeting you all. My sort of plan is to talk you through who I am, the submissions process, and some kind of top tips for crafting your pitch. But I want to leave quite a lot of time for questions. So if you have questions, you can pop them in the chat and I'll start going through them when I'm finished. And you can ask those questions at any point. I'll just come to them when I'm done and ready to answer. So to introduce myself, I'm Hattie. I'm an agent at the Blair Partnership. The Blair Partnership are a newer agency compared to some agencies. I think we've only been around for about 8 years. I've been there for 1.5 years, so I'm still a newbie there. And I'm the kind of lead fiction agent there. We represent children's fiction too. We represent J.K. Rowling, obviously the most famous of our authors. We do a lot of non-fiction, sports books particularly, and kind of personal development, self-help books. And I kind of lead the adult fiction list there. My tastes are towards the more commercial end of the fiction spectrum, but I feel like I am quite broad in what I look for. So I look for crime fiction, I look for historical fiction, book club fiction, romantic fiction. The only things I don't really do a lot of science fiction and fantasy. I'm okay with things with a slight magical or science fiction twist, but definitely nothing that's kind of at the core of those genres. And I don't look at very experimental literary fiction. Otherwise, I'm open to most things. Some of the books that I've been working on this year, coming out next month, and it's a really exciting book coming out from Penguin called The Summer Job, by an author called Lizzie Dent, which is a wonderful romantic comedy set in Scotland about a woman who pretends to be a sommelier at a fancy hotel for a summer, even though she knows nothing about wine, nothing about fancy food. A bit later in the year, there's a slightly darker novel, The First Day of Spring by Nancy Tucker, which is a kind of fictionalization of the Mary Bell murders about a little girl who kills a little boy on the estate she lives on, and then 20 years later has been given a new identity and is trying to learn how to live with the kind of guilt about something she did at such a young age. And I do a lot of other things, books come out all the time on my list, romantic fiction, particularly publishers a lot more often. But anyway, we are not here just to hear about me. I'm here to tell you how to pitch adult fiction. And I think I'm especially coming at it from the point of view of how you're going to pitch to an agent, because that's my area of expertise. And I wanted to start by talking you through the submissions process. If you don't know what an agent does or why you might need an agent, agents represent authors and sell work on their behalf to publishing houses. Most major publishers these days require submissions to come through an agent. They don't accept direct submissions. There are some exceptions to this, especially on the more commercial end and digital first lists. Often they do accept direct submissions, and on the very literary end, smaller presses can accept direct submissions. But for the vast majority of debut writers, you're going to be looking for an agent if you want to have a publishing deal. And there are lots and lots of agencies in the UK, and though the submission process varies slightly from agency to agency, the key factors are the same. The majority of agents ask for you to send them a cover letter, which explains who you are and what the project is, a synopsis, which is usually about a page and summarizes the entire plot of your book, and then a sample of your writing, usually 10,000 words, 30 pages, 3 chapters, around that length. So when you're getting to a stage where you're thinking about submitting to an agent, what are the first steps you should go through? I think step number 1 is to absolutely make sure that your manuscript is done. A lot of the time I get submissions from people who tell me they haven't finished their novel yet. There is no rush to sign with an agent, and especially in adult fiction, no one is going to be able to sell your book to a publisher if you haven't finished it. And I think even if you know that you will finish it, your agent doesn't know that you're going to finish it. So it's so hard to write a whole novel, and it would be a huge risk for me to sign an author who didn't have a finished manuscript, because I know a lot of authors who never get to that point, who can't quite pull their whole plot together, who get to the end and realize there are so many unfixable problems at the beginning that they have to scrap the manuscript. There are lots of reasons you wouldn't finish it. So you have to make sure you've finished your manuscript, and not just finished it, but you have made it as good as you can on your own. This means different things to a lot of different people. I know there are some people who you might have a writing group who you can share with. You might have close friends and family who can read it for you, and you can get a bit of feedback that way. You might have a more kind of formal process. You might be doing an MA course, or something like the Curtis Brown or the Faber Academy workshops that give you feedback. Or it might just be you on your own, reading through again and again and making sure it's edited to the best it can be. Definitely you want to have done at least one edit on it before you submit to an agent. Don't just finish, type the end and send it off. I think you really have to put it in a drawer for a month, reread it again and come back to it. You will spot a load of stuff in it you want to change. And if you haven't managed to find that stuff you want to change, I think that's a sign that you haven't read closely enough, because there is no novel that I know of that is written in one draft and published as it is. Almost everything gets edited. So once you've got to a stage where you are really, really happy with it and you know you've done everything you can to it, then you're going to start looking at who you might submit to. That's something that I think is very overwhelming for a lot of authors, is finding which agents they want to submit to. There are so many agents out there, and it can be difficult to know who to go to first. You can't possibly submit to everyone. Even if you have the time, most agencies don't let you submit to multiple agents, so you have to pick. I think the best way to start by looking for an agent is to think about the authors who have books out recently that you've really admired and find out who represents them. It's quite easy to find out who represents authors. You just type their name into Google and write agent, and it will tell you who represents them. The other things you can do are look out for agents on Twitter who've done call outs recently. It's very useful, I think, to find agents who have said recently that they're really actively acquiring, because some of the more older established agents might have very full lists, and it might be harder to get onto those lists. Younger agents, newer agents of that agency are often more actively acquiring, more actively building their lists, and they might be better bets. So I think that's a good place to start. You can find out agents' taste. Normally, agents have a profile up on their website that tells you what they're looking for, and you can also see who else they represent. But there's also, their Twitter. Often agents do interviews that you can easily find online, which explains a little bit more about what they're looking for. As agents, we're really trying to put out as much information as we can about the kind of things we like to read, because we want to make sure we're getting the right submissions. So the more research you can do, the better. And I think in a first round of submitting to agents, it's good to aim to centre 5 agents. Any lower than that, and you've not given yourself a lot of choice or a lot of opportunity, and any more than that, and it can be a bit overwhelming to manage. I think 5 is a good number. You could do a few more if you wanted. Once you have your list of who you're going to submit to, make sure you go to their websites and write down really clearly, so it's clear in your own head, what the submissions process is for each agency. The agency will, all agencies have slightly different submission process, which I know is very frustrating. That's just a factor of it's a free market and we don't all get together to discuss how we want to receive submissions. And every agency works a bit differently. Like in some agencies, books are read first by the assistant. In other agencies, the agents read first. Some people need postal submissions because all of the submissions go off to a reader. Some people just like to do their reading on the physical format. Others prefer to get it by email to a certain inbox that they can check once a week. Lots of different ways. So you have to make sure you know who you're sending it to, how you're sending it, whether you have to print and post or email it. Make sure you know exactly what you need to send. So how long does the synopsis need to be? How much sample material do you need? Does the cover letter have any specific requirements? Once you've written it down, have all your material prepped and ready to go, and give yourself time to proofread it all, make sure everything matches what you're meant to do. Try not to get panicky or rushed when you send it out. Just do it very slowly and carefully. There is no rush. So to break down the different parts of your submission. First of all, the cover letter. And this is, I think for most agents, the first thing they're going to read. I think there are a few agents I have heard say that they don't even read the cover letter and they go straight into the chapters, but I think the majority of agents will read your cover letter first. So this is how you're going to make a good impression. The key thing I'm looking for when I read a cover letter is to find out what the genre is, to kind of orient myself to know what I should be expecting from the first page. Because if I go into a submission, I know that I'm looking for slightly different things in the first page if it's a crime novel versus if it's a romantic novel. For a women's fiction or a contemporary fiction novel, it might be really good for a first page to set up the characters really well in a way that gives me an immediate emotional connection with them. A crime novel, I'm probably looking for a really dramatic, frightening opening that's going to kind of catch my interest. So the different genre, I need to know that when I open the chapters. So I need that from your cover letter. I need to know what the plot is. So I know what's the hook, whether this is going to be something that's really interesting or stand out in the market. And then I need to know a little bit about you. I don't need huge amounts of information about you at this stage. I definitely don't need to know why you started writing in the first place, your entire background. For me, what's most interesting to find out in your cover letter is what writing experience you've had, whether that's publications before, whether that's writing workshops you've done, any kind of feedback or editorial work you've already done on a novel with a professional is always useful to know. And then also what it made you want to write this book particularly. Is it that you were inspired by a real life situation you were in? Have you done any interesting research? Is it based on a true story? All of that kind of information can really help to whet my interest when I'm coming to a novel. So I sort of talk about the cover letter as being structured as in, dear agent name. And then I think it's really good to open in a very professional way, saying I'm writing to look to see if you will offer me representation or something like that, to really kind of state your intentions. And then to have an elevator pitch, which is 1 or 2 sentences that quickly summarize the novel. I'll come back to that later in a bit more detail when I talk about how to pitch. Then a slightly longer blurb, which is similar to the blurb you see on the back of a novel when you buy it in the shops. And then a paragraph which explains who you are and why you wanted to write this book. And that's really all you need in your cover letter. It doesn't need to be incredibly long. And definitely focus on the book first and the about you second. The synopsis, I know, is everyone's worst part of the submission. Everyone finds this hard. So if you're trying to write a synopsis for your submission right now and you're struggling, you're not alone. I hate writing synopsises for my clients' books. So I know it's really difficult. I have to say, one of the best pieces about how to write a synopsis I've seen, and one I often send to my authors, is written by Hattie. So I'm sure she can link you to that. But for me, I think the key points are it's a really functional document. It's not meant to be a sales document. You don't have to write it in the voice of your character. You don't have to write it in a really pitchy, exciting way. It's just meant to tell me what happens in the story in order, in a way that's very easy to follow. You don't have to include a lot of subplots. Try and stick to the main plot itself. Try and keep it as short as possible. Even if an agency says you can have 2,000 words for your synopsis, I think keeping it to 800 words is still a really good idea. The shorter you can keep it, the better. When you write your synopsis, I think it's really good to give it to someone else to read through, and especially someone who doesn't know what your novel is about, and they can point out if anything doesn't make sense to them. Sometimes in a synopsis, you might introduce a character later on and you haven't really explained who they are or something like that. So it's just really good for someone to check for the logical inconsistencies, and make sure you tell me the ending. Part of the reason I need a synopsis is to make sure that the novel, the sample chapters that I'm really excited and interested by, are actually going somewhere, and that you've plotted out a whole book that makes sense. Sometimes when a synopsis is causing you issues, you might need to take a step back and ask whether those issues are issues with the synopsis and how you're writing it, or whether those are issues with the novel. It can be a really interesting exercise if you're really struggling to have a short synopsis that feels compact and makes sense, to use that to then understand how you might need to re-edit your novel. So it's not bad to start a draft synopsis at a very early stage of writing a novel. It can help you to understand where the plot is going. I'm happy to answer any more questions about synopsis writing in the Q&A. And then your sample chapters. The sample chapters should be the first, for most agencies, the first 3 chapters of your novel, roughly. I know it's really tempting to send me chapters from the middle of a novel. If you think you've written a really good climax, then I often have people who send me chapters and they say, look, the beginning doesn't really get going yet. I want you to read another character's voice. It has to be the opening. There's no one who's buying a novel in a shop who starts it halfway through. You've got to just, you have to get the first 3 chapters interesting enough to hook my attention. And if they're not, that suggests you need to go back and edit them again. Really, the first 3 chapters for me are the most important part of the submission. I don't really mind if the synopsis isn't the most fluent document. And if it shows me that there are plot errors, I will normally try and work with an author to fix them if I love the voice of the novel. So making sure that those first 3 chapters are incredibly polished, incredibly slick, really well proofread, not full of exposition or backstory that is going to slow things down, is really key. And the more feedback and editorial help you can get to get those chapters as polished as possible before you send them, the better. You're going to be in a really good position if you can do that. So I mentioned earlier this idea of an elevator pitch, which is the kind of short pitch that gets people excited and interested about your book. It's really hard to kind of summarize a book in 2 sentences in a way that feels unique and interesting. And a lot of people struggle to get to what the kind of key hook of their book is in that amount of time. I see a lot of elevator pitches that are very vague, ones which really talk about the themes of the novel more than the novel itself. And I think most people actually don't read a novel for its themes. It's great that a novel teaches you something about life or love, but I don't think people choose a book off their shelf because they want to learn particularly about those things. What people choose a book for is an interesting plot, first and foremost. And so the hook, the elevator pitch, it has to be based on the plot itself. So the questions you need to ask yourself are, what makes your book original? What is it that you are doing that is different to what other people have done? And if there is something really key that you think is the most interesting and different thing about your book, make sure you've managed to fit that into your elevator pitch somewhere. But you're also looking for what is similar on the market to prove that there is a market and an audience for your work. And that kind of balance between originality and market research is the key to any pitch. It's one of the things that is most on my mind whenever I'm looking to sign a new author. So I'm really, it's hard to get that balance, but that's what you have to be thinking about when you're thinking about your pitch. But the key thing for an elevator pitch, I think, really is thinking about what the question is that keeps your reader reading. And in some genres, that can be much more obvious than in others. So I think if you have a crime novel, it's very easy to know what the main central mystery is that's going to keep your reader reading. If you're writing a more book clubby novel or a contemporary fiction novel or a historical novel, you might have to think harder to kind of find that question in your mind. It could be that there's still a mystery at the center of your book. A lot of books are mysteries at their heart. But the question could also be about your character's motivation and an obstacle that's in their way. If you have a character who's really looking to do something, whether that's fall in love or find their family or make it work in their career, and there's something that's stopping them, that's often also a kind of common question that keeps a reader reading in your book. But if you can't think of that question or that driving force, or you're not establishing it early enough in your novel, that is often a problem I find in a lot of books. I think when we talk about pacing and keeping a reader's interest, sometimes that's down to a voice that puts in too much detail, too much information, too much research, too much description. That can slow a book down. But I find the most common reason novels are slow or don't hold readers' interest is because it's not really clear what I'm reading for from the very first pages. And when I read a book, I really want that key question to be established on page 1, because that's the only thing that's going to keep me driving through the novel. So taking a bit of time to find your hook and incorporating that into your pitch is going to be really helpful. And then once you know the answer to the question about what makes it original and the question about what keeps the reader reading, you can keep that in mind when you build your pitch. Your pitch should normally be about introduce your character, introduce the setting, and then introduce that question. And once you've kind of got that in your mind, that pitch will be really clear on the page. Okay, great. I think I've spoken for about 20 minutes now, which is Good, and I can see there's a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm going to start answering them. And so if you have any more, please do continue to post them. Okay, going.
Would you like me to go through these for you, Hattie?
That would be really helpful, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Hang on, let me just switch out the view. Unspotlight you somehow. Here we go, so we can see everybody's lovely faces. Right, so we have lots of questions. Let's go with, oh, my video's off for some reason. There we go. Joanne asks, will UK agents support or take on writers living outside of the UK?
So yes, a lot do. Some agencies do have policies against this, and they're really focused on the UK. I think the question you should be asking isn't always, will an agent represent me, but am I best represented by an agent in that market? And that can depend more on your work than who you are and your nationality. For example, I often choose not to represent American writers who are writing fiction based in America because I don't know editors in the US market as well as a US agent would. I couldn't ever know them that well. And I'm all going to, so UK agency, we charge 20% commission in the States, whereas a US agent would charge you 15% commission in the States. So I'm charging you more money for less expertise. My expertise is in the UK market. I just don't think that's a choice that you should necessarily think is a good one for you. And I think even if you're desperate to get your first agent at the start of your career, most authors, if they take off with me in the way I would hope they would, will probably get to a point in their career where they realize that they will be better represented by an agent in their own market. And then I've done a lot of work for another agent, really. So I think even though I'm really not prescriptive about it, and I do have American clients, and I have clients from all over the world, and books set all over the world, I think it's always on a client by client basis, and it's not always the best option if a book is very American or very specific to that market for me to be the agent who represents it.
Perfect answer. Thank you, Hattie, and a very honest answer. So I guess thinking about where your book most sits and into which territory it would be most likely to sell. We have another question here from Julia, who says, Hattie, would agents look at a manuscript that has been previously published but where you have had rights reversed back to you?
Again, some agents will. If I really love a manuscript that has rights reverted, and I can see that there's a new market for it or a kind of change in circumstances that would allow it to sell again, I would be willing to give it a try. I think it's very hard to resell a manuscript that's already been published before and hasn't been hugely successful unless you can see an obvious new route to market. So I would prefer, I think, to look at, like, if an author has front list that I can work on actively, and there's reverted backlist that I could try to sell as well as that, that's a slightly fuller package. So I would rather you came to me with a new project, but you said also rights to my previous book are reverted, so we could do something with that too. That's a more interesting conversation for me. Again, I'm not prescriptive about it or black and white, and I've seen at my old agency, we had a lot of success with taking on a client who had been published before and had those rights reverted, and we resold them, and we resold them in a lot of territories around the world. So it can work really well, especially in more literary markets. Often there's more potential there than for commercial fiction. I think often has its time, and when that time has passed, it's hard to resell those rights.
Thank you. We've got a question. This is a really hard one to answer, but I think it will be of interest because I think a lot of writers are thinking it. You know, you've talked about a hook, and when we're talking about pitching, it's about that elevator pitch and how the hook comes into play. We've heard it in the morning sessions as well. Our speakers talked about a hook. What exactly how do you make a hook sound good? Is it something that's just is or isn't there, or how do you construct one?
I think normally you can find a hook. It might not be there on your first draft, but you can bring it out more in the redrafting. I think if you've managed to get to the end of a book, there has been something in that novel that has been tugging at you to finish, a question you want to answer about your characters, something that a mystery you want to solve or something that's really exciting, and you have to then, when you redraft, work out how to bring that excitement you had to finish the novel to your reader, because a lot of it could exist in your head but you haven't managed to get it to the page yet, or you might find out what that hook is 75% of the way through the book. I see that quite a lot, and you need to bring it back to page 1.
Well, this is what you were saying, isn't it, earlier about if there is something wrong in if you're really struggling with a synopsis, maybe there's something in the book. So possibly it's similar with a hook. If you're really struggling to articulate something, even if it's not a big dramatic thing.
I mean, there's a lot of very quiet books, but still have a very hook, which just exists inside, like the tiniest bit of a character's psychology, but it's so interesting and hasn't been articulated before that you read it through. I think someone like, like a book like Olive Kitteridge or something like that, those hooks can be really small, but they can absolutely grip you. And then in crime novels, the hooks can be really obvious and big because it's a mystery you haven't seen before. I think it's really about thinking what your process was when you wrote it, what you were most interested in, and trusting in that interest and working out how to communicate that to your reader.
That's a fantastic answer, thank you. And we've got another question which is all related to hooks. What should you do? You were talking about crime thrillers often having hooks. What should you do if the hook is also your plot twist? How do you handle that when you're pitching and when you're submitting?
This is a hard one, and I've had a book where we really struggled with this question. It was a novel called Exquisite by Sarah Stivell, and it's wonderful. If you haven't read it, I would really recommend reading it. But the twist in the novel, it was the hook, and it was quite hard to pitch it without giving the twist away. I think when you pitch to an agent, don't worry too much about that. We're training ourselves to get the twist, even though we already know what the twist is. That's part of our kind of professional reading. And then you can see, so it's so much easier once you have a whole marketing campaign behind a book where they can say, you won't know, guess the twist in this one, something like that, Behind Her Eyes, that they can say that there's a twist without you having to explain what the twist is. So I think if your hook is your twist, just tell the agent that in your pitch letter, your submission letter, and your synopsis, and then I'll know what I'm working with when I pitch it to agents, to editors. And then there's the second challenge when we're pitching it to market, but there are more resources there to help you.
So I suppose the writer's doing one thing and pitching to you, you're then pitching onwards in a slightly different way. Okay, perfect. And then we've got a question about if a writer has been previously represented, they don't say if they're still represented, but if a writer's been previously represented, but that particular manuscript hasn't found a home, how would you advise them to move the project forward? Now, I should say this writer hasn't said whether it's already been sent out or not, and I think there might be two different answers. But Hattie, you'll know what those two might sound like.
Yeah, I think it will really depend on how widely that book has been sent out. If an agent has sent it to 20 plus editors and it hasn't found a home, it might be time to say, okay, this project is not the right time for it. It might be in the future, but I have to find a new book now. I have to find a new project. And, there are lots of books that I've worked that I think are amazing and I've worked really, really hard on and sent to so many people and just haven't sold. And it's really tough, but it's a very tough market and there's not always a way through that. If you have an agent who hasn't really sent it out, who is maybe like asking you for edits again and again and again, and you don't seem to be clicking or connecting on what the book is, or if it's an agent who has sent it but hasn't sent it out to that many people, and when you ask them about it, they're sort of avoiding the question and aren't really giving you straight answers, then I think it's absolutely fine for you to look for new representation and be honest with any new agent you approach about what the issues were, without bad-mouthing someone who might be their colleagues. But, we all have had authors who we might not click with correctly. And I don't think that's necessarily a reflection on the agent or on you as a writer. It's just about making sure that the match is right. I don't want you to feel like you're trapped in an agent relationship that isn't working for you.
I think also some writers will feel nervous about that because they think it might be their only shot. But, you know, as you've seen today, there are so many industry professionals who are out there and engaged and willing to look at new material. So please don't feel, you know, if it's not the right match, it won't be someone who can publish you well. So please do feel confident to go elsewhere if you need to. We've got a question here about, in the covering letter, if you are giving comparison titles, so books that are similar to the one that you are pitching to this agent, is there a rule, or is it risky to have a comparison title that's just been released or that's contemporary? How contemporary ought they be?
I think the more contemporary, the better, to be honest. Don't pick very old books by dead writers as your comparison titles, because anything that's thought of as a classic, like it's unrealistic to compare yourself to them, and the market will have changed so much that, you know, there are some books that are classics and phenomenal and brilliant for their time, but just wouldn't be published now because the market has completely changed. So you want the more contemporary your comparisons, the better. I think if you're comparing, like, for example, if you'd read a proof on NetGalley that hasn't even been released yet and you wanted to use that as a comp, I'd make sure you said in your cover letter that you had read it on NetGalley, you'd read an advanced copy, because sometimes I've seen, especially if a submission is submitted to me and comparing themselves to one of my clients' novels, but that novel hasn't even been published yet, I'm a bit dubious. I'm like, have you actually read this? It doesn't sound like you could have done. I think you're just saying this to suck up to me. So, but if you're like, have read a really contemporary novel and you think it's a good comparison, then use it. There's nothing wrong with that.
Thank you. We've got a question about multiple submissions. So you've encouraged people, as we do at TLC, to make multiple submissions, but to keep it strategic and at a number that's manageable for you. And Hattie has also run a kind of how to submit to an agent the holistic way with TLC, where we've looked at anxieties and managing those. And one of the reasons to submit to slightly fewer agents is getting 50 rejections all at once or 50 silences can be very, very stressful. But in that process, how do you manage submit? How transparent do you need to be about disclosing it being out on multiple submission? And then the other part of this question is, how long roughly will it take to get a response?
So I think most agents assume when they get a submission that it's with other agents. So, you know, it's fine to say in your submission letter, I've sent to other agents, but you don't even need to. I think that is at this point understood as the default. And then in terms of response times, every agency is different. Even agents within the same agency will be different. And I would look at their website. Most agencies have a guideline on how long it takes them to respond. Some agencies say, if we haven't got back to you within X weeks, assume it's a no. My agency, we try and respond to every single submission. At the moment, I'm responding to most within 3 weeks, but we say on the website that it could be up to 12 weeks. So there's a big range. Some of my colleagues get more submissions than others, and so it takes them longer to get back.
Great. We have a question here about resubmitting work. So if you've had, I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but if you have sent to an agent and then and they've said no, or they haven't responded, and you've rewritten it and you really feel confident that this time it's much better, how do you feel about resubmissions?
If you've really rewritten it and it's been a year, I get so many submissions I probably won't 100% remember it. And I think most of the time you can get away with it if you have made significant changes, particularly to your first 3 chapters. If you have, make sure you're confident that you have made significant changes, because I do get a few people who I reject, they send it back to me a week later, and I know when that's happening too, and that's very, like, that is a sort of a complete blacklisting offence to me, and that's someone who I don't think is professional enough to work with. And also, if it comes to, if you've had a full manuscript request, the agent will normally send a bit of feedback when they reject a full manuscript, and they will say whether they, I always would, and I think most agents do, say whether they think this is a feedback which means you could revise and resubmit to them, or whether they think this is feedback which you can't really fix and you might need a new project. Like, I will always distinguish if I've read a full manuscript and I'm rejecting it between whether I want to receive more of their work in future or this work again. So make sure that you're reading properly there. It's quite frustrating if I've rejected a full manuscript and then I get it sent again with edits when I know in my heart this project isn't going to be right for me. I will say if I want to revise and resubmit.
Sure. We have a question about agents and editing. I think this is kind of a two-part question, which is, well, one thing to say is that the question is, agents can vary quite widely in how much editing they do. Some are quite hands-off, some would like to work with the author in a very hands-on way. The question is sort of how do you know, because you might be a writer who would prefer to have a certain kind of editorial relationship, but when you're submitting, you don't know what that agent's approach necessarily will be. How might you manage that if you already know how involved you would like an agent to be with editing?
I think it's hard to know at that initial submission stage. There might be interviews where agents talk about their editorial process, but I expect agents who don't do a lot of editing don't talk about their editorial process in interviews, so you don't know if that's someone who hasn't been asked the question or who is sidestepping the answer. But it's definitely something you can ask if you get an offer of representation. You can have that conversation at that point. And I think it's also, if I get a submission, because I'm a very hands-on editor with my authors, and I get a submission from someone who says, I'm really happy to do edits on this, then you've signaled to them what kind of writer you are and what kind of agent you're looking for. And I think that can help find the right match earlier on. If you know that you're someone who's not going to want a very hands-off, non-edity agent, then you'll help to, just like getting your cover letter for a job correct by saying what kind of job you're looking for.
That segues quite nicely into this idea of once you have, say you're lucky, you're getting through and you've got offers of representation on the table. I think writers sometimes feel like they're just being interviewed by someone who may or may not represent them. But of course, it's about a match, like you say. Yeah. What things might it be useful for a writer to think about asking or saying at the point of having a chat with an agent who might wish to offer them representation?
I think there are lots of questions which I normally get asked in those. So I often get asked about editorial process and what I think having a really good conversation about editorial notes at that stage where you ask questions about things that you're not sure are working in the novel and what the agent thinks is really good. First of all, because you need to know what the edits are going to look like before you sign. You don't want to agree to do edits that you don't think fit your book, but also having that very in-depth editorial conversation will tell you how closely your agent has read the book. And I think that's going to be, that level of love and passion is going to be the number one thing which tells you whether that relationship is going to succeed or fail. So don't be afraid to get really nitty-gritty talking about your book in that meeting. But then other good questions are asking about the rights situation. So does this agent handle translation rights themselves? Do they handle film and TV rights themselves? Do they work with co-agents? Do they have colleagues in their team? Or are they a lot of agencies who tend to do world rights deals with editors? And that's got its pros and cons, but ask your agent to elaborate on why they do what they do, how that works for you, and make your own decision on that. And then asking about who they would submit to, how big a submission they're imagining, and how the process would work, and what sort of timeline they're thinking. Asking them, I don't know, ask the question you are really curious about, and don't be afraid to ask it. I know that I've had some very off-the-wall questions, but I never begrudge anyone asking me anything in those kind of things, because this is a serious relationship you're committing to. And you need to make sure you're making the right decision. Yeah.
Great. And then we've got some questions, we've got quite a few questions about sort of writers either not hearing back or not really getting anywhere. If you've submitted to those initial 5 and you've got absolutely no responses, how do you deal with how you formulate next steps and how far you want to keep going and for how long?
I mean, it will depend on the author, I know, but 5 is a very small number compared to the number of agents who are out there. And I would say you want to keep going, at least 2 more rounds after that. if you're still hearing nothing, especially if you've picked quite ambitious agents in your first round, like ones with a lot of big name authors and very busy lists, you're more likely to get feedback and responses if you're doing a round which includes some smaller, younger, newer agents. So make sure you're doing that too. And remember that rejection will happen at every stage of the publishing process. So that's part of a practice too that you have to get used to. Even once you get an agent, when they send it out to editors, you'll get a lot of rejections at that stage as well. So you have to get some resilience. 5 is a very small number. Based on the number of agents in the UK, even 20 is quite a small number. You could do a much broader submission from that and still find the right person. One of my clients had been rejected, I think, by 170 different agents before I signed him. And then when I sent him out, we got a 6-figure preempt. So, those rejections don't mean anything. But it means something is that one acceptance.
And I suppose, like you were saying before, the match is so important. And by doing it in batches of 5, so, I think the answer to this writer's question is don't stop at 5.
Yeah.
Batches of 5 and continue until you feel you're ready to stop, have a break, do whatever you need. I also did want to just say on this note of, hundreds of rejections and then a publishing deal or whatever, that only works if you happen to find the right person. I think sometimes in this industry, we get a little bit dazzled by this idea of a genius stumbling blindly until they find a person who recognizes their genius. And that actually, if you're doing it 5 by 5 and focusing on strategy, focusing on why, you're clear about what you're writing, you're clear about who you're pitching to, you're more likely to get a strike than you are if you are doggedly imagining that somebody out there's got to recognize your genius and not actually putting enough thought into it and scattergun approaching submitting to agents. So it's just something to sort of bear in mind, please, writers. It's also not very good for your mental health either. Okay, there's some comparison stuff. I think we have addressed these. Wait times, you've also addressed those. Resubmitting, we've talked about that. Is it fair to say, I think we've sort of touched on this, but I think it's still worth asking this question. Is it fair to say that at bigger agencies, you might get less attention and a less personal experience from the agent, or how does that vary and work?
I don't think that's always fair to say. I think there can be small agencies which have a huge client list and you don't get any attention because there's just one person. I think it really varies. Some big agencies still have a very personal feel, and some agents at some agencies work very, very closely with their authors. So I think it's much more about the individual agent and how busy their list is. I think it's fine when you meet someone to kind of ask them how many other books they're working on at the moment, like what else are they planning to submit that year, how many other editorial projects have they got ongoing, and to ask them questions about what their communication style is after the book is published, and find out from them what they think the standard of communication should be at that point. Because I know that there are agents out there who they're really excited about the deal, but then they sort of drop off the radar. Or if a book doesn't sell, they drop off the radar. So, asking an agent what their strategy is if the book doesn't sell is also a good question that I get asked quite a lot.
That's a great question to ask an agent. That's a fantastic tip for everyone. I can see people furiously writing into their notebooks. This is good. We're in the final minutes of this session. Just quickly before we answer the final questions, I do want to say at 3:00 we end this session and we have a 10-minute comfort break. At 3:10, the very final, very short last session of the day begins, which is just our roundup webinar, which should only last for sort of 15-20 minutes. So at 3:10, please use the link in the portal to come back into the webinar, and we will declare the long list, short list, highly commended, and winner of the TLC Pen Factor, which Hattie was part of the judging panel for. So that is Very exciting. But on to the final questions before we round up this brilliant session on pitching your fiction to agents. We have a question here, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I should be able to answer quickly. If your submission doesn't have chapters, so if your book doesn't have chapters, how can you send the first 3 chapters? Am I right in thinking normally an agency will say first 3 chapters or X thousand words?
Yeah, and I think I used to get, when I was working on the reception desk of an agency in my first job, people would call and ask me about all the time. But they just want a decent sample of your work. We say 3 chapters, but 10,000 words or 30 pages, that about that length. And no one is going to reject you because you sent a bit more or a bit less.
Great. We've had somebody asking kind of where they find agents. So Hattie has already said, look at people who are being interviewed, who are attending conferences and events, because once you get to hear an agent speak, as you've heard Hattie, I think probably however many, 95 of you in the room are getting a sense of what she'd be like to work with, what she's interested in. So seeing somebody in person at an event or at a recording, really, really useful. The Writers and Artists Yearbook is an annual publication. It's quite expensive, but you can get a reference copy in good central libraries once they're back open. There is a website, I better not say too much about it other than to say it's on a subscription basis that you pay for, and not everyone can afford that, and I think so many agents are freely available online to search for. I'm not entirely convinced of the value of a monthly payment system to find agents. Up to you entirely, so I will leave that link up there in the chat, but that's my personal opinion. The final question then for this session, because I think it's a really lovely one to end on. What, in your opinion, this is not exhaustive detail, Hattie, of course, but what in your opinion does a good contract look like for a new writer?
Obviously there are lots and lots of nitty-gritty bits, and it will depend on what you want your publisher to do for you. I think it's best in your first circumstances to keep back as many rights as possible. So only let them have rights that they are planning to publish in directly, which is normally just UK and Commonwealth, not audio, not America, not translation rights. Sometimes World English might make sense if it's a digital first contract and then they'll publish in Amazon across the world. But if they're telling you they want to do a print edition and they're not going to do a print edition in the States, don't let them have US rights. Make sure that they're paying you fair royalties. That tends to be 10% for a hardback, 7.5% for a paperback, 25% for an ebook. Make sure that they have sub-right splits clearly laid out in the contract. And I think the most important thing, if you're a first-time author, is to look really carefully at anything like an option clause. You do not want an option clause that compels you to sell you their next book on the same terms. We think those option clauses would probably be illegal and wouldn't hold up in court, but a lot of publishers use them, and it's not going to be good for you because an agent will then not really be able to do anything with you if they can't sell you to a new publisher or something different. So if at all possible, keep the option clause out entirely. If not, make sure it's very restrictive, that they have to answer within a certain amount of time, and that you have a right to return down that offer.
Whistle-stop tour through what Hattie feels a good contract looks like, just to reassure you in case you were desperately making notes. Normally, this is why we recommend using an agent if you're negotiating with a publisher. This is what they do. They will protect you. They will look at contracts. They have the know-how and the expertise. If you are, for whatever reason, unrepresented or don't wish to be represented, we highly recommend you use a service like the Society of Authors to look at a contract before signing. If you're independent or if you're with an agent, don't ever sign a contract without understanding it. If you are through an agent, the agent will explain it to you or take care of it for you, depending on your preference. And if you're on your own, go to the Society of Authors. That's one of the resources we are going to pop into the Online Writers' Day forum at the end of the day. Do bear with us, but all 3 members of the TLC team are attending each of these sessions. So after the day is wrapped up, we will put all of the links and resources to everything that's been recommended throughout the day into the portal. It's 3 o'clock exactly. So that leaves me to say a huge thank you to Hattie. And Hattie, in the chat, we've got loads of people saying thank you so much for a fantastic talk and insights and your generous time as well. We're really, really grateful to you for being part of the TLC Online Writers' Day and part of the TLC Pen Factor judging panel. We are going to wrap up now, and as I say, please direct yourself back to the portal. You've got a 10-minute break now. At 3:10, please do sign in for the last session of the day, where we're going to round up and declare the winner and find out who's been longlisted, shortlisted for the TLC Pen Factor. So thank you, everyone, and a huge thank you especially to Hattie.
Thank you for having me. Lovely to see you all.
Bye, everyone. See you in 10 minutes.